Henry here. Welcome to our first video of our Renaissance Academy plein air videos. In this video, I'm going to take you through how to paint a lavender field. It's basically just a meadow. I think a lot of people want to know how to paint fields of flowers, or just it's a very basic open meadow, sky, trees, and so forth. So the goal here is I'm just going to do this video. I would encourage you just to watch the video, read the workbook, take whatever notes you need to, and then you take your materials with your notes, equipped with your fresh knowledge, and get out in the field and find something similar. As we go along, we're going to introduce all kinds of other different type of landscapes that people might be interested in. And so buckle up, we are ready to start plein air. All right, so this is an area of the lavender field where we went that I thought looked the most interesting, and this is how I composed that scene based on the scene before me. So what you do when you get to an area after you're all set up is you go ahead and start with toning your canvas. I prefer to do this right at the beginning because it gives me sort of a middle tone value to work with. And I had originally started with a lavender background and quickly changed my mind because I want some of this canvas to show through and support a little bit of what I'm going to build on top of it. And so I went with sort of a warmer soil cover, knowing that most of this painting is going to be in cool lavender tones. I felt that this warm sienna foundation underneath the painting would lend itself better to that cooler tone and give it just sort of a nice balance. So I am just taking burnt sienna, and there was a little bit of that violet still in my brush, which kind of toned down the sienna a little bit. So I'm just applying it with a thin mixture of Gamsol, and it's a little darker than I need, and I'm not worried about all those marks because I just take a paper towel now and I wipe off that wet glistening mixture. You'll be able to see when you're doing this on your own that there's a lot of shininess from the Gamsol, and so you wipe that down a little bit, and now it's ready to go. And it will feel a little bit dry to the touch. You can touch it and your fingerprint will show up, but you can still paint on it and the paint will stay. You can also wipe it out a little bit if you need an area where you want a brighter value. And so I demonstrate that a little bit in here. So when you get to a location, what you want to do is look around for an area that might have an object or a situation that really pleases you visually and looks interesting. So I chose this area because I liked the diagonal of the lavender rose. I didn't want to paint them just horizontal across my canvas or vertical. And I also liked the backdrop of the dark trees. I felt that that would really frame in and showcase the lavender and the hay bales. The hay bales were positioned pretty much like staccato, so I wanted to break those up and cluster a couple of them and make them look interesting to help lead the eye in and support the lavender field, just as a little bit of visual interest. Because sometimes you can pick a scene that tends to get fairly static. So by breaking it up and adding some textural and variety, textural differences and variety makes it much more interesting. So what I'm doing here is I've just put together a mixture of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and I've thinned it down just a little bit with the Gamsol. At this point, this is the only time I'm going to use the Gamsol to paint with. Eventually here I will be switching over once I start adding color, and the only thing I'm going to use the Gamsol for is cleaning my brush. At this point, however, I am using it to thin down my paint a little bit so it's like ink. So I'm taking my vision from my thumbnail sketch and I am putting that on canvas just as I had sketched it. I'm laying down the area. I'm not even looking at reality. I'm not looking at the meadow or the lavender fields. I'm strictly looking at what I had planned in my thumbnail sketch. And that is one of the ways you can minimize your time. You really only have an hour, and you'll see in this video how much the lighting changes. So with my thumbnail sketch, like I said at the beginning, I use that to help just give myself a game plan. And so I'm sticking to the idea of where I put those hay bales on my sketch and using them almost like music notes to bring the viewer in like that. and the size of the trees in relationship to the meadow, giving each thing an interesting proportion of importance in the painting. knowing that those little spiky trees off to the left over there are going to have a dark value that gives it a little bit of weight over there. And then the cluster of large oak trees on the right will give you a larger area of dark. So the two balance each other in an interesting sort of way. And I'm connecting those two masses with a little bit of shadow under those trees that line the meadow. And I should be using a larger brush here. I do think I switched to a bigger one, but what I'm trying to do is just lay down the value. And I want to establish that these trees here are closer than those spiky trees in the distance. And you don't see the spiky trees in this video because they were a little bit behind me. And if I had just left the scene before me with just the trees and the meadow and the field and the hay bales exactly the way I saw them, it would have been visually boring. So you have to actually make those decisions when you're out in the field to kind of move nature around, and you cannot be that literal. So, move the hay bales, move the trees. The trees were behind those, I guess they're cypress trees. They were behind me, and I turned around and saw them, and I knew that they would be much more visually interesting in my scene. So I established that, and I love that about being creative with plein air, is that you have that freedom to choose to do things. And so I'm also using a little bit of those strong, dark, contrasting values in the lavender field as it's closer to me. So those are working their way back, and just connecting everything and leading the view right from the lower right up to the left area and then back into the picture. All right, so I'm about to mix the color for the sky, and I'm just going to wipe off my whole palette now. And I wanted to point out that I had taken a little bit of Gamsol on a very clean, dry brush and just wiped out a little bit of the value for the sky, and because I wanted a little bit more of that value differentiation between the darks of the trees and the middle tone of the ground, and then the light of the sky. So that was important that I get that going. So I do use a lot of paint because I do want to you have limited time when you're out there in the field. You got to mix it up and lay it down. You don't want to be continually going back to your palette to mix and mix and mix. So just make a nice big pile of what you need. So there's the sky I had to work with, and I want to point out that beautiful purpley tone at the top. And I mixed that with just ultramarine blue and white. And at this point now, I'm just using linseed oil, little tiny dot on the corner of my brush. You don't need very much. And I start at the top of my canvas, and using small vertical brush strokes, I just lay it down. I like a vertical brush stroke like that rather than a horizontal sweeping brush stroke, because I just feel that I can lay down the pieces of paint a little better. Of course, you can lay down paint as you want, but I just would definitely caution against that sweepity sweep, sweep, sweep type stroke. And so I'm just going with this nice little piece of paint color. And again, that is just ultramarine blue and white. And I wanted also to talk about, this is a piece of linen taped down to just a panel. And that is a really nice way you can do paintings, because when it dries, they don't take up much space in your studio. As I move down the sky here, I'm going to add a tiny bit of phthalo green to that blue and white mixture, and that will warm it a little bit. If you've noticed, the sky at the top is very cool violet, and then as it gets down towards the bottom, it's a little more turquoise, and lighter. So you can adjust that by adding a little bit of the phthalo green, and it warms it up just a bit. And so just a touch of linseed, and moving on, that's just how I would work that out there. I did feel that as I'm going through this painting that sky was too middle tone and to do the same from top to bottom. So I felt I needed to push that. You can see here I pushed that violet dark at the top a little bit more. And then later on I make it a little bit lighter towards the horizon because it needed a separation there. It will create more of a dome-like effect, which is very attractive and very pretty. And so, like I was saying, this is just a piece of canvas taped down with artist tape to a panel. And if you like what you're working on, when you're done and it's completely dry, you can glue it down to a board and you're ready for framing. So now what I'm doing here is I'm just mixing up the greens for that background. And I'm taking a little bit of cad yellow and yellow ochre right into that blue sky mixture, and it makes a really soft sage green. And so there's a close-up of there. And what I want to point out too is when you're in nature and you're looking and you really focus on something, it can be you can see it too brilliant, too bright, too strong a contrast. You always have to take the whole scene in perspective. So when I'm looking at nature and I'm looking at those background trees, they look darker and brighter because I'm focused on them. But you have to zero in on what it is that your painting is about. So in this case, the painting was about the lavender fields, and I loved the support of the straw bales. So I need to look at those things, and while I'm looking at those, I just, out of the back corner of my eye, then I look at the support of the background trees, and they become lighter. And so I'm painting them a little bit lighter and less screaming for attention. So you really have to be very careful about paying attention to the digression of values as well as color. So I'm painting the grass in the background, and that is picking up more of the sky reflection on the grass. So anything vertical in your painting, such as trees or hills or whatever buildings, are going to be darker than whatever is getting the light from the foreground, or excuse me, from the sky. So the sky is hitting the grass and it's going to be lighter, and that just gives us that visual separation. And so the trees back there have to be a little bit darker value than the ground. So I'm mixing up a little bit of ultramarine blue, a little bit of sienna in there, just a little bit. It's not very dark. And I am sculpting out the underside of the meadow trees back there, trying to create an interesting shape and keeping the value a little bit closer in family to what I see in those trees. Instead of painting them as black as I see them in real life, I have to keep them in the same family that these trees are in. Because, like I said at the beginning, I want to connect the two tree clusters from the left and the right with this subtle value under the trees. Also, I'm trying to work on an interesting shape under the trees just to have that visual interest. And you'll see that as I'm working along here too. I kind of am just tweaking that shape as we go. And I don't want it to be very distracting, so I do come back through with just softening those shadows just a little bit. I'm picking up some of the, and I take some of that little bit lighter green, and I just work on that interesting shape there. I don't want any of those screaming for attention. They don't need sky holes or they don't need a whole lot of information, just an interesting shape, just to be visually exciting a little bit. And I want to also point out how you hold your brush. It's something that we often neglect to talk about, but it's very important. Oil painting brushes come with a long handle so that you can get back from your painting and really take it all in as a whole. If you hold the paintbrush down by the silver ferrule, you tend to get really precious with your painting, and you don't want to get really fussy with it. So just keep your hand way back, hold your brush loose, and apply one or two couple of strokes with your brush, go back and get more. And so that it just makes a really big difference in painting. And I'm softening, bringing a little bit of that dark down into that meadow to help kind of sculpt out the land a little. Now I'm taking some cobalt violet, and I did put a little cobalt out here just to, you do need occasional colors that you just cannot mix in nature. And once in a while, I will put out a little cobalt violet. I do keep a little magenta in my bag. There are some pinks of flowers that you literally cannot mix with a limited palette. So it's fun to keep a few extra colors in your bag. But this is our standard palette that we use for all of our plein air and studio and portrait. There are a few colors we'll be adding to our portrait section and so forth as we go on, but that is the basic. All right, so again, I'm just going back behind those cypress trees and pulling in a little bit of information back there just for some visual interest. and mixed up just a little bit more of that bright sage green just to reflect the sky hitting those. So I'm working on the hay bales next, and I want to show you how you can see on there. They're very staccato, and I thought it'd be much more interesting to rearrange them. And you have to work on things like this in layers. So here I just mixed up this brighter green grass because I need to work that around the hay bales a little bit more at this point. So that bright green you can get with phthalo green and cad yellow, and it gives you just use a teeny bit of phthalo. As you move forward in your painting, everything closer to you is going to be more brilliant, stronger contrast, more pronounced brushwork, brighter colors. As things get farther away, they get less brushstroke, less value contrast, less brilliant color. It's softer and more muted, and that will give you that illusion of atmosphere and distance. So I'm taking just some blue and brown, a little bit of cad yellow, and I'm going to paint these trees back there. Now I just make a very subtle value differentiation from those cypress trees to this big cluster of oak trees because I really want to point out the gradation of values as they go away from us. Everything up close to us is going to be stronger contrast. So if you painted both those cypress trees and the big oak tree, they would have, if you painted them the same strong dark value, our mind wouldn't be able to separate what's nearer, what's closer, what's further away. So you have to sometimes even push it a little bit more. Those cypress trees you won't see in this video, I forgot to get a picture of them, but they were behind me. And that was something that I really wanted in this for that reason, just to give you that balance. So now I'm adding a little bit more blue and phthalo green to that shadow mixture under the trees to really create that feeling that this is now on a different plane. This shadow is in a different area. A little phthalo green added to that will really cool that shadow down. And I added a little bit more to the foreground down here because I want to create that vignette feeling to the painting. Again, it's the letter C type composition, leading the eye in from the lower right, and that darker corner down there in the left helps to keep the eye in the canvas, bouncing out the viewer back up into the lavender fields and way back into the background, giving us that really interesting composition. So again, I'm just adding a little bit more highlight to that back there just to push that value extreme a little bit more. I know it probably seems like I'm really spending a lot of time fussing around with the background, but one of the things I want to point out too is I kind of compare painting to having these different elements in your painting to like TV movie actors. You have one star of the show, then you have a couple of supporting actors, and then everyone else is just background. And so you have to have everything really encouraging the star of the show. In this painting, the star of the show is the lavender fields and the hay bales, that general area. So the supporting actors then are the cypress trees and this oak tree. And those are really encouraging this framed in feeling for the lavender fields. And then everything else is background. Every element is important. And what I'm doing here now is I've taken a little bit of burnt sienna and alizarin crimson and painted in, there were some rust-colored bushes, which really, I thought, added a really nice touch of warmth in that background. It's very important to add those. And so I had mentioned before in the watercolor lesson, we talked about painting with a secondary color scheme. And this one is actually very much that you have a lot of green, a little bit of purple, and then that warm orange from the ground and those rusty bushes. Very important. And again, here, I'm really pushing that value difference between those background trees and the sky. I felt that needed even some more white. And I think that helped. I was satisfied with that difference in there. I did not want to add any clouds. There weren't any clouds in the sky, but I thought that it would have been distracting. Again, that background are all of those extras in your movie, and they cannot be distracting. They have to perform a function, and they support the star. So if I'd added clouds, it would have just been way too busy. So here I'm just pushing that, again, that little bit of lighter back there, keeping in mind that has to be way far away. And I am using a horizontal stroke there because those brush strokes have to define the lay of the land. And so I'm even a little bit angled as it slopes down. It wasn't that angled in real life, but I really wanted to play with some of that little variety that I saw back there. And I am using, this was a size 5 bristle brush. I like that for grabbing some nice solid paint and laying it down. So now I'm working on these straw bales, and I'm just starting to put them in place where I felt that they would be visually interesting. I had one little one, and then I put 2 together, and just laying them down as a solid mass of color at this point. Still allowing my brush stroke to define the form. You can see them back there. And then a larger one towards the edge of the canvas there. I felt that it made it just more visually interesting to have them broken up like that, leading the eye in. And there they are. I can see them very much like staccato. I was not interested in having them being that evenly spaced. Okay, so now I'm establishing that strong anchor, that value for that tree. That is mostly ultramarine blue, a little bit of sienna, and just laying that down as I saw that as a mass for the shape. And this is a size 6 flat. Just scoop up the paint and lay it down. I squint at those trees. I'm squinting at everything all the time. And right under my hat. It's important to wear a hat when you're out plein air painting because it helps to block the light from your eyes, obviously. If you didn't have a hat, it would be very difficult to get an accurate representation of color. You almost get light blinded. So keeping yourself in the shade is good for also keeping you cool, but to help you visually too. So again, more of that ultramarine blue, burnt sienna. And I really want to just keep this mass simple. The main thing that you really want to get out of plein air painting is to capture the color and the light and atmosphere of an area. The object is not to complete a finished, highly polished painting. You only have an hour before the light has changed quite a bit. If you can keep it under 2, you're doing pretty good. So here I'm just squinting down at that tree, and you'll see I paint this almost as very simple 3 values. Mostly dark, a middle tone, and towards the end I do a little bit of highlight on the top. But it's just squinting their abstract shape and letting it just sit, not getting fussy with it. No, even though you can see all the leaves, you do not need them. Again, you're just there to record the light and the feeling of this moment. And that is just a little bit of phthalo green, cad yellow, and some ultramarine blue. And I also want to point out just laying down the pieces of paint in strong, simple brush strokes, allowing them to sort of define the form of the tree. Just short, choppy little gives you that nice suggestion of a tree. And then as I get towards the edge, I am actually allowing some of that sky to mix with the edge so that it doesn't look all cookie cutter, but has a nice softer transition from tree to sky. And it'll give it that soft feeling of the tree having a form of roundness. And as I go down the tree, it gets darker and darker because all of the work and the foliage down below is getting less sunlight. Everything is brighter at the top of trees. And so just think about, you can see here I fuzzied this image just to show you the hay bales down at the bottom, sharp and crisp, and that tree was very fuzzy. And that's kind of how you want to do it. And so always be squinting. And that's what that should look like as you're squinting. You just simplify the mass. And that lighter tone was done with just a little bit of cad yellow right into that mixture. And I also wanted to point out, sometimes I get asked a lot, how do you know when to make an edge soft and when to make an edge sharp and crisp? And what I like to just say, to really keep it really simple, soft edges are for continuity, when you need something to go on, okay? So if you have a round object, you need that to feel like it goes on and on, like that edge just goes on. So you soften that edge. If you're painting an apple or you're painting a rounded tree, soften those edges. You also need a soft edge if you need the eye to move. Again, the concept is going on. So when you have a sharp, strong edge on something, it stops the eye. And you can use that to your advantage to help direct the eye. And that'll make a lot more sense when we get into still lifes, because we're going to talk a lot about that and guiding the eye through a painting through the use of edges. But I want to get your mind starting to think about things like that as we're moving along. You can see here as the shadow of the tree reaches the meadow grass, I soften that edge because I don't want the eye to stop there. Even though if I look at it and concentrate on it in real life, I see a strong sunlight, strong shadow, but I soften that because you don't want that to be a stopping place for a visual place. Right here where the hay bales are, we're approaching my center of interest in the lavender field and that depth right in there. So I am going to spend a little bit more time in there getting the straw bales and that area just the way I want it. And so with all of this and this scene in particular, there's a lot of layers now as I'm working on the grass, the dirt, the hay bales. And so I will talk about those different layers as you're working on something like this. So here I am just laying down some of those different lighter values back in there. Cleaning my brush off. It's only used for Gamsol at this point. A little bit of sienna. I'm going to work on some of the dirt that is in front of the hay bales, some of the hay bale color, a little bit of ochre in there. And those are done with just a very simple, I just lay down a color for the actual straw bale. And then I'll go back in with the shadow on a little highlight. And that's all you have to do to keep those very simple, 3 values. There's my lighter value, ochre, sienna, and white. And just laying down, very simple. Circle for the front of the hay bale. And then sort of that cylinder shape. Remember in our drawing, we worked on drawing cylinders. So you'll see tree trunks and all that now that you have that in your mind and your psyche as you're working forward, remembering cubes, cylinders, and spheres. So I'm just mixing up a little bit more sienna and ultramarine blue to create a little bit stronger shadow, just to sculpt out the shape of these cylinders a little more. Thinking about the light hitting the top being brighter, and then you'll see here in this picture as they go around and down, they're a little darker underneath. Very simple values. And then as you get those in place, then you just, I'll just lay down that strong piece of grass in front. So if you have an object in something that you're painting, maybe a cow sitting in a meadow, you would do that exactly the same way. Just paint it as one dark mass, or one medium tone mass, give it a little shadow, a little bit of highlight, paint the grass around it. Or maybe there's a little shed that you're painting. Same thing, same concept. So, and you may have to go back through and kind of clean up your shape a little bit. But as you can see here too, as I'm mixing, I am not stingy with my paint. I put a lot out and lay a lot down. It's more difficult to work with very thin paint on your canvas. If you have enough paint on there to work with, it's almost like sculpting a little bit. You can play and push and pull, and I do want to point out you can't do that with acrylic. With acrylic paint, it's dry. You put it down, and literally seconds later, it's dry. So you don't have that freedom to push and pull the way that we do with oils. The oils are extremely forgiving. If I didn't like this painting, I could scrape it all off, wipe the canvas off, and start over. And so, another thing that I really love about oils. So I'm just putting a little bit of highlight on the tops of the bales now, just to let that, have that illusion of catching some light there. So the light around the ground. And this is, I'm concentrating here too on the dirt as we're getting over towards the area where the lavender is going to be. And my mind's starting to work in layers. So here I'm just pulling at that sharper accent of these bales out just a little bit more. ultramarine blue. Playing with the fronts of these bales. Like I said, these are pretty close to the area that I want as my center of interest, so I do want to give them a little bit of TLC. Not much, but just a little. If I were to go back to the studio, I'm always asking myself, how much information would I need from this scene to go back to the studio? You can see one of the hay bales here, and turn this into a larger painting. So you really only need to give yourself what information you need from the scene in the event that you wanted to go back and make it into something else, something bigger. So, what is the right color? What's that right value? And that's what I'm doing here. And I just mixed up that sharper, darker accent underneath because I still was pushing and trying to get the value just right. But I think that I finally reached that area that it was satisfactory. All right, I think I'm feeling good about that. So we move on, and I'm laying in some more of the greens around there, just to pull that through a little more, that area. And again, always being cognizant too of the weight and the angle of the brush strokes. As I'm moving forward now into this area of doing this entire foreground, I'm going to be concentrating on greens and different layers. You can see there's the soil, then there's some darker shades of green, then I build up the layers that way with the highlights. And so I'm keeping this whole mass as I mass in the greens for these rows. It's very simple. Just a little bit of ultramarine blue, a little bit of phthalo green, and some yellow ochre, cad yellow. You'll learn the different amounts of this and that to make different greens, but by working with a limited palette, you only have a few options. So I would definitely say play with these colors, add a little bit of sienna, see how that warms it up and makes it a little bit more like an olive. Just little things like that you can do. There are times and places in here where I'm going to let that sienna undertone show through because I want that golden sort of glow to play through the lavender. And again, allowing my brush strokes to show the form there too, in the rows. And if you notice, as I'm going further back, I am adding a little bit more white and cad yellow, little yellow ochre to that, just to let it recede off in the distance. Not very much of the yellow, a little more blue, things like that, just to let that recede, giving you that illusion of everything close to us has a brighter, richer green, everything farther away fades off into the distance. So as I'm thinking about how, you can see in the background here, how the rows are composed. We have we have the soil, then we have the dark green grass, and then on top of that dark green, we have some highlights. I'm not going to add the highlights until I've built up a little bit more of the shadows under the actual lavender bushes. So that's what I'm working on here. Way off in the distance now, because I like to work from the background to the foreground, I'm mixing up that far away lavender color, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and some white. A little bit of ochre or some of that green off to the side will neutralize it a little and make it less garish purple. So you can tone that down a little. So I am making that background area of lavender just a simple, light, soft mass. Just gently dragging that over the top surface of the green and letting some of that green underneath and the brown show through. It gives it that feeling of airiness. Like lavender is very airy, so the worst thing I could do would be to lay a dark, solid, strong piece of purple. Just a very soft, the brush is barely touching the canvas. It's called a scumble. I'm just scumbling the lavender over the top. You'll hear me use that word from now until eternity. I use the word scumble all the time, and that's you've got a little bit of paint on the brush. It's not really heavily loaded, but you take a little bit of paint and you just gently drag it over the surface and some color falls off. And so that's a scumble. And so now I'm thinking about a soft light green. again, building up the values around the plants themselves. So thinking far away and dirt, ground up. So those lavenders back there are done. So as I'm coming near us, I'm adding a little bit more highlight because I'm going to build up more of the rose now around that highlight. Always going from far to near. A little bit of vertical brush strokes back there give it the illusion of being a little tiny bushy plant. And so I'm taking what I had scumbled and just moving it to look more like lavender plants. A little bit more purple. Just suggesting some more chunkier, choppier areas off to the right, because again, I'm bringing the eye in from the right, so I want some more of that interest over to the right. And as I come back through into the background here, I want that to be less vibrant and back there, just providing beautiful background of color to bring the eye in. And that is, again, that alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. And I'm thinking about my rose. I can still see some of that canvas sienna showing through. And as I come over the green, I'm just going to do a few little dabs. And those are almost suggesting the shadows under the lavender clumps, because I want those to have that sculptural feel of each of the rows. And so here's some of that, a little bit more of that dirt color in there. Yellow ochre, a little bit of sienna. Letting that just be what is in between each of the rows. It gives it that sense of direction and a little bit of that dividing lines. Makes it feel more like they're in rows, and I do like that feature. As long as they weren't just solid, straight lines, but break it up with a little bit of variety, makes it visually interesting. And I do add a little bit of darker accents in there just to make that, again, feel more sculpted. But the grass and the lavender are creating little shadows around the dirt. So always building up those layers that way. Dirt to the grass, to the bush shadow, the bush itself, and then the highlight on the lavender flowers. So here's my darker, and I have that little brush, the size 2. And coming back in, and you can see now, it's really starting to take on that sculptural feel by adding some of those darker accents. So if you're somewhere and you want to paint a field of flowers, you would definitely take this route, doing these, and watch this video a few times. Working on layers like this is something that until you can see it, it's difficult to look at a lavender field and know how to break down those layers. This is how you do it. Just very simple. And so that's all I'm pulling out here, just some of those accents without going nuts. Remember, again, farther away, they are softer shadows. Up front, they're stronger. And it really gives it that illusion of near to far. And that's just the ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Short little staccato brushstrokes. All of the brushstrokes are helping us to have that visual understanding of what it is we're talking about. This is a little bit larger, I think it's a size 4 flat. And I'm using this to kind of soften and let those things, those lavenders back there, just be in the background. And then I'll work on the ones in the foreground and give them a little bit more clarity. All right, now I'm going to be working on the foreground flowers. But to do that, I'm going to build up a little bit more of the highlight on the grass. Just like I did in the background, I built up some of that highlight after I did the purple. I'm going to get some of this brighter down in here, and then I'll be building up the flowers over that. Just gives it sort of that foundation, almost like if you're a gardener and you have the grass in your garden and you're going to dig an area and put the flowers on it. That's what I'm doing. I'm starting with that nice grassy area in between the rows, and then I'll be planting the flowers above that. So once that grassy place is in where it needs to be, I'll go back through with some of my darker accents to figure out where it is I'm going to be putting each of these clusters of lavender. And that's what I'm doing here. Taking some ultramarine blue right into that green mixture, yellow ochre, and it's just a richer, nicer, little bit stronger shadow, and that's what I'm figuring out here is if I put one here, if I put one here, if I put one here, where is it aesthetically pleasing? Where does it have that almost musical feeling throughout? And people wouldn't even really maybe pick up on that when looking at your painting, but they'll feel just this sort of subconscious, oh, beautifully placed. If you just make them all staccato like the way they are in real life, it's not that visually pleasing or interesting. So you get to decide where those lavenders are planted or where your trees are planted. If you've got rows, if you're painting a garden, rows of corn, place them interesting. Make them look interesting. It'll be much more pleasant to look at over time. So now I am just working on, again, laying in the passages where I want these clusters to go. A little bit more. I'm just checking that these little areas have the right kind of clarity, the right kind of voice. A little bit of highlights where those shadows are going to really, where I need them to stand out. And I'm thinking about if I have a sharp shadow here and a sharp shadow here, highlight, shadow, highlight, where is that going to lead the viewer through the painting? And some of the time here too, I'm softening some areas that were just too sharp and too contrasting. I didn't take anything out of this video. I didn't fast forward any of it. It's just all in real time. I really want to, definitely show you that this is a possibility. You do not have to take all day on something. Just keep it clean and simple. I took a little bit of that cobalt violet and added it to the alizarin crimson ultramarine blue mixture, and I'm just laying in with just a little chunk where I want the lavenders to go. I'm being sensitive. I'm not just putting in a globby, but it has a nice soft feel. I'll come back through and add a little bit more richer color to that, to the ones in the foreground that I really want to jump out and sing. And so you can see here, some of the paint that I'm putting down is a little bit thicker, and so I don't mind that. And if I'm going to play with thick paint, then I want it to be thicker up close to me. So I'll put a little bit down, and in this case, I didn't mind it being a little thinner, so I kind of took out some of those globby chunks. But here I'm using more of the cobalt because these ones are closer to us, and they are our directional flowers here. They're going to bring us in and curve us off to the upper right. So pulling us around, playing a little bit more with that cobalt back there, and I'm also softening too. Now I'm going to add a little bit of white to that back there because I felt that it was getting a little too heavy, and I wanted that to feel a little more atmospheric over there. And again, just adding some highlights to the tops of the clusters of lavender now. Because you paint the middle tone. First I did the shadow underneath, then you paint the middle tone, and then just a really simple highlight, like an upside down C's, or sideways upside down C's of these lavenders. A simple little curve and a highlight. And then, again, keeping the brush strokes soft. If you're too heavy-handed, they'll look like purple caterpillars. So you want to keep them soft, a little fuzzy. If you're painting lavender fields. We'll get into, in the next few videos, we're going to talk about painting trees, meadows, rocks, whatever. Those are all sorts of different things. Water. And so, again, towards the end, there comes a time when you need to know what is enough. Have I said what it was I really meant to say? And so those are your deciding factors. And what I did edit out of here was all the times that I stepped back from my canvas and I looked at it. And I asked myself, am I there yet? Have I reached it? And these are questions that you need to keep in mind, and only you can answer. You have your concept, it is what you wanted to say. And you need to know when you have reached that voice. And so here I felt I needed some of those stronger, vibrant pieces of grass, phthalo green, cad yellow. So I popped some more of those in the foreground, and I did feel that that made a difference. And sometimes it's just a matter of a few pieces of select, bright, rich paint in the foreground, not the background, and it makes a big difference there. So cleaning my brush, I'm just assessing the situation, maybe a few more spots of cobalt violet. And I'm pretty much wrapping this up. There really isn't a whole lot more I feel that is necessary. You can actually pick a painting to death, and you don't want to do that either. The key with plein air is to keep it fresh and alive and vibrant. And these are actually, people really do enjoy purchasing plein air paintings because they love that vitality of the freshness of life. So I would encourage you to just really challenge yourself with keeping it under 2 hours. 1 hour is better. And only take in the notes and the colors that you need to really capture that moment, that feeling. So that's pretty much how I wrap this up, going back through, cleaning and softening, and just maintaining that overall feeling that I wanted to get for atmosphere. And again, here I'm just pulling out a few of these little areas where I really wanted a little bit more impact. Lightening that sky, keeping things interesting up there. And that's it. I'm getting pretty much done. Wanted to thank you guys for joining me. I hope you enjoy this, and I hope that you feel challenged and excited to get out and try this, because I think that you will enjoy plein air. I'm not going to lie, it's one of the most challenging things for painting that you can do. You'll find out quickly. There's a lot that you can't control, but if you work on being efficient with your time and your thoughts, you'll be able to do it just fine. This is very exciting. And remember, it's a numbers thing. Allow yourself that freedom to make mistakes, but you can do it, because you really can. And you'll get addicted. There's nothing more rewarding than getting out and having an afternoon just painting out there. Okay, that wraps up our first plein air video. Now it's your turn.